Walter White's character has always fascinated me. The genius underdog, the dying man who had nothing to lose, the desperate father doing whatever it took to protect his family. But beneath the surface, things were far darker. From the moment Walter stepped into the drug trade, he destroyed lives left and right. His victims weren't just drug lords and DEA agents, they included innocent people who never even saw him coming. Because the worst thing about Walter White wasn't that he was a killer, it was that he killed people who had no idea they were even playing the game. This wasn't the Godfather, where everyone knew the rules. This was a chemistry teacher with an ego problem, leaving a trail of innocent bodies just to prove he was the smartest guy in the room. So let's break it down. Who were the innocents that Walter White destroyed? I remember the exact moment Walt became irredeemable. Not when he killed Crazy 8 and D'Amelio, we can sweep it under the rug in the name of self-defense. Walt's true character was exposed during the life and death moment in Jesse's room. Jane Margolis wasn't a threat. She wasn't his enemy. She was just a woman in love, trying to pull Jesse out of the hole they'd both fallen into. And yet, Walter stood there, arms at his sides, and watched her choke to death, like a scientist observing an experiment. No interference, no emotion, just cold, clinical detachment. I bet that he told himself it was for Jesse, that without Jane, Jesse would be safe. But let's be real, was that ever the real reason? Or was this the first moment Walter realized what it felt like to play God? Psychologists call this the slippery slope of moral disengagement. One day, you're justifying small lies. The next, you're watching someone die because it benefits you. History is filled with men who convinced themselves that their terrible choices were necessary, like Oppenheimer justifying the atomic bomb, or Nixon believing Watergate was for the greater good. Walter White was no different. He told himself every lie he needed to hear, convincing himself that every life he ruined was just part of the plan. And this was just the beginning, because once he learned he could take a life, he didn't stop. He got better at it, more efficient, more ruthless. Jane Margolis was Walter's first innocent victim, but she wouldn't be his last. Actions have consequences. That's what Walter always told Jesse. But here's the thing about consequences. You don't always get to decide how big they are. Jane's death wasn't just tragic, it was a trigger. Her father, Donald Margolis, was an air traffic controller, a man whose job depended on focus, precision, and a clear mind. And Walter took all of that away from him. Psychologists call it cognitive overload, the way grief, trauma, and stress hijack your brain, making even simple decisions feel impossible. Donald was grieving his daughter, and in that state, he made one mistake, a miscalculation, a delayed response, a moment of human error. And that mistake sent Wayfarer 515 crashing into another plane over Albuquerque. 167 innocent people, gone, just like that. Imagine sitting on a plane, sipping your overpriced airline coffee, thinking about what you're going to do when you land. And then, in an instant, the sky opens up, and you never get to finish that thought. Debris and bodies fell from the sky, and Walter watched as the consequences of his decision to not save Jane unfolded in front of him. He stood in his backyard, staring at the wreckage, and guess what? He felt nothing. That's when I realized Walter White had completely disconnected from reality. Instead of having a slightest regret, Walt tried to justify his actions with an embarrassing school speech.
Or maybe even 3/4 full? Well, at any rate, what you're left with, casualty-wise, is just the 50th worst air disaster. Actually, tied for 50th.
I mean, seriously? 167 people died because of your single choice, and here you are trying to tell the kids to look on the bright side. This wasn't just about making money anymore. It wasn't about saving his family. Because at this point, innocent lives weren't even collateral damage. They were just background noise. While the Wayfarer victims were completely innocent, Walt's next target on my list falls into a grey area. Now, I know Gail Botica wasn't really an ordinary citizen-level innocent, but hear me out. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't a kingpin or a cartel boss. He was just a nerd who loved chemistry, Italian espresso, and singing bad karaoke in multiple languages. Honestly, if Walter had left him alone, Gail would have happily spent his life perfecting meth like it was a Michelin star dish. But Walter preferred his survival over everyone else. And when the time came, he didn't even have the guts to pull the trigger himself. Just like a wartime general would, he handed Jesse a gun, gave him a cold, calculated order and forced him to do it. This wasn't just a murder. This was psychological warfare. Walter knew Jesse had spent his whole life trying not to be a killer. He knew Jesse had been haunted by the people he'd lost, the lives he'd already ruined. And yet, he shoved him into that doorway and made him pull the trigger anyway. It's called moral injury, the kind of trauma that comes from betraying yourself. The second Jesse fired that shot, something inside him shattered. Because Gale wasn't just a stranger, he was proof that Jesse still had a soul, and Walter made sure he killed that too. Walter didn't just eliminate a loose end that night, he eliminated the last piece of Jesse Pinkman that still believed in redemption. Unfortunately, Walt's ruthlessness wasn't limited to adults only. Walter White was many things: teacher, husband, father, kingpin, but this was when he became a true monster. He didn't kill Brock, not like he killed Mike or Gus or the dozen others who got in his way. No, this was worse, because he poisoned a child just to manipulate Jesse, as if he hadn't already tortured Jesse enough. Let's put that in perspective for a second. A grown man, a high school chemistry teacher, sat down and thought, how do I turn Jesse against Gus? And instead of literally any other option, he landed on poisoning a 6-year-old. This is what psychologists call utilitarian morality, the idea that some sacrifices are justifiable for the greater good, except in Walter's case, the greater good was just himself. And what's even worse, Walter actually convinced himself this was smart, that it was all part of the plan. Because in his mind, no life, not even a kid's, was worth more than his own victory. And if you ask me, the scariest part is that it worked. Here's this guy pulling off wild stunts one after another, and he keeps getting away with them. I can call Walter many things, but I can't take away from his genius. Even though that genius was rarely used for good, Jesse, devastated and desperate, turned to Walter, the very man who caused Brock's suffering in the first place. Walter played the part perfectly, comforting Jesse, acting like the concerned father figure, and when it was all over, he smiled. Although Brock was saved at that last moment, things didn't always end that way, unfortunately. Another kid that became victim of Walt's drug empire was Drew Sharp, a 14-year-old on a dirt bike, riding through the desert, minding his own business. He didn't know Walter. He wasn't a threat. But the second he appeared at the wrong place at the wrong time, Todd shot him. No hesitation. No second thoughts. Yes, I know Todd pulled the trigger, but do you really think Walt felt any remorse? He didn't panic. He didn't scream. He just watched. Because while Jesse stood there, shattered, and while Todd casually went to grab a shovel like he just squashed a bug, Walter gave the order. No funeral, no remorse, no hesitation. Just business. See, before this, Walter's empire still had some illusion of logic. It was about survival, about strategy. This was needless. This was when Walter's empire stopped being about protecting his family and started being about protecting itself. When all was said and done, when Drew Sharp was erased from existence, Walter didn't just move on. He went back to work. He cooked. He made millions. He never even mentioned Drew later. This wasn't self-defense. This wasn't a war between criminals. This was a child gone because he was inconvenient. And Walter White just let it happen. But not all deaths that Walt caused were physical. He never shot Jesse, but he didn't have to, because by the time Jesse was chained up in that pit, cooking meth for Jack's gang, Walter had already killed him in every way that mattered. Think about it. He lied to him, used him, made him believe that they were partners, then threatened him like nothing more than a disposable pawn. He poisoned Brock just to mess with Jesse's head. He let Andrea die just to punish him. And when Jesse was finally broken, when there was nothing left of the kid who once dreamed of a better life, Walter leaned in and delivered the final blow. I watched Jane die. That wasn't a confession. That was a bullet to the soul. Walter knew exactly what he was doing, because Jane's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was Jesse's turning point, the moment that sent him spiraling. And Walter let him believe it was his fault for years. That's the kind of thing that not only hurts, it destroys. Because Jesse Pinkman didn't die in that pit. He didn't die when he was beaten senseless or forced to cook meth for monsters. He died the second he realized Walter White never cared. The second he realized he was never a partner, never a friend, just another loose end waiting to be tied up. And when Jesse drove off in that El Camino, screaming, crying, barely able to breathe, that wasn't relief. That wasn't a victory. That was the sound of someone who'd finally escaped the man who spent years slowly killing him.